Thank you and good afternoon. So I'm delighted to be here talking with you today about some of my thoughts on privacy. And my hope is to sort of inspire you to actually think through hard questions as opposed to necessarily give you answers. Oh, that's not going to work, so we will just keep going. All right. So one of the things we know is that big data is extremely exciting, and many of us in the room are really invested in all of the amazing possibilities of things that we can do with large data sets. The questions are boundless. We're really excited about the different possibilities, even when there are some dark questions, as came up on the previous panel. I think it's really exciting to have that moment in the sun and to really be amongst people who recognize that. I also think it's really important to realize that there is a lot of fear out there. And a lot of the fear about what's happening with this data, who's using this data to do what will it mean, how do we understand it? And a lot of those questions keep pervading even the people who are participating in this data revolution, even people who are participating by giving their data to these massive social media sites. There's this question about what it means about Big Brother. There's a question in terms of violations. And a lot of those questions have to do with this circling notion of privacy. People wanting to actually sort of make sense of and deal with privacy and not really being sure how to. And it's this contestation around privacy that I think is going to be central to a lot of how we're going to talk about these issues going forward. And I think it behooves us to figure out how to have that conversation amongst those of us who love playing with big data before it becomes an issue more generally within the public. Generally speaking, these things turn into a dichotomous or polarizing attitude around it, right? Data good, data bad. Privacy, we has it, privacy, we don't has it, right? And this is sort of this tension that I think that gets us into trouble, the utopian and dystopian turns that we've seen over and over again in this. And I think it's a time to step back and try to get away from those polarizing narratives and figure out where we want to go with it. Now, I personally prefer a much more sort of nuanced approach. And I don't know how many of you have seen some of the arguments by Jeff Bowker, but one of the things that I love that Jeff points out over and over again is that we cannot just turn to raw data. We actually need to cook it, and it's the process of cooking it, the process of making sense of it, really interpreting it, really analyzing it, understanding and appreciating it, that allows us to get the meaningful insights that we think of as having value. And that's really critical as we start to deal with some of these issues, and it's particularly critical as we think about privacy. Because privacy, in many ways, is an uncooked thought in a lot of these conversations. So I want to sort of dive into some of what that means. First, let me put a call out for those of you who haven't seen the paper that Kate Crawford and I wrote, which was an attempt to write a series of provocations for those who are really invested in data, to try to ask some sort of key questions, in many ways from a critical theoretical lens to people who are really playing with data. And one of the pieces that we come into that has to do with this question that of just because it's accessible to you doesn't mean it's ethical to use. And this is really the turn in which I'm going to sort of dive in today to talk about privacy. Now, my goal of talking about privacy here is because, well, actually, Nosh was sort of, what are you going to talk about? So Wendy sort of teases that I actually knew ahead of time because Nosh is sort of teasing me about, like, what you going to talk about? And I was like, privacy, sure, okay, I'll respond. But part of it is because I think that getting into the attitudes that people have about privacy is really important. And even though we can talk about privacy from a very technical standpoint, I'm actually going to go into a lot of my ethnographic work to try to really untangle how we can understand privacy. And I think that we can do it with a big data mindset available to us. And I don't think that these two are unresolvable notions. But I think to get there, we actually have to understand privacy. And more often than not, I find that we don't tend to understand privacy in technical environments because we assume it to be things that in many ways the public does not assume it to be. So let me start with some of those assumptions. The first thing is that privacy is not the same as security. This gets conflated over and over again. Now, part of it is that for tech folks, even when they're synonymous, it doesn't really make sense from a sociological point of view. People often use security as a proxy to achieve privacy, and when they feel confident in how a system is actually architected, they feel as though they can trust that system, and that allows them to actually go through and try to manage or make sense of privacy. But the two are not actually the same thing. And just because you have a secure system does not necessarily mean people feel as though they understand privacy. Implementing privacy and implementing security are fundamentally different concepts and require different models of thinking. The second core thing to realize is that privacy and anonymity are also not the same thing. Just because you want to hide, just because you want to make certain that you're not revealed, doesn't necessarily mean that that's about privacy. There's a whole slew of reasons as to why people achieve privacy or achieve anonymity, that they go out of their way to do so, some of which we can argue are legitimate, some of which we might argue are not, but they're not necessarily the same thing, and we shouldn't push people to a state of anonymity just because they want to have privacy, right? And so there are people who use anonymity as a way to achieve privacy, but they are not the same. And in many ways, one of the funniest things I learned in sort of diving into privacy is that people actually have the flip of it, which is that the more that they have a sense of privacy, the more open they are. And that's often really confounding and confusing to people. The third sort of key thing to remember is that privacy is not the same as an access control list, right? Even though we often use ACWLs as a way of modeling privacy or thinking we can achieve privacy. It's also not the same as a set of settings, right? And privacy settings, again, are a tool in an effort to achieve privacy, but they are not the same as privacy. And just because people have modified the tools, which they often still don't necessarily know what they're doing. Esther Hargitay is in the room. She's done a lot of work looking at how people do not necessarily know what they're doing with their privacy settings, even when they think they do, right? But also, even when they've managed to control this, that doesn't mean that they've actually achieved privacy. So with all of these knots, what exactly is privacy? Now, the way that I think about privacy is that privacy is the ability to be in a social situation where you have enough agency in that social situation and enough knowledge about the social situation to control how information flows within that context. Right? And that combination is extraordinarily hard to achieve. Right? It requires agency, it requires a level of knowledge and the skills to actually acquire that knowledge to make sense of the environment, and then the ability to control the situation. Right? The ability to determine whether or not you will share my information. Right? And this is actually where we get all these questions of trust in as well. Because part of it is that if you take technology out of the picture, right? If I'm sharing information with you, I'm trying to assess what the situation is. Do I trust you? How do I understand what you will share or not share? Will you spread it? What will I do to be able to restrict you from spreading it? How much of it is about incentives or about our relationship? How much of it is about a formalization or a mechanism where I can prevent you from sharing it? And of course we get, the whole joke of, the only two people that can share secrets is if one of them is dead, right? There's these challenges around this, but this is this effort. Privacy is a process, and privacy is a process around agency and knowledge. Right? Now, hold this in mind as we think about some of the technologies and see some of the cultural logics of how this plays out. One of the reasons I would argue that privacy is so much more complicated today and how people are trying to achieve it is the defaults in our environment have fundamentally changed. And this is because of a mediated context. Right? If you and I are chatting out in the hallway, right, by default, our interactions are relatively private by default, public through effort. What that means is that we're chatting, you might pick up on things that you thought were interesting, and then you go out of your way to tweet them or share them or broadcast them loudly. But that effort that you take is about publicity. It's an effort to actually make that semi-private conversation public. And therefore, when I'm looking at you and deciding what to share, I'm making a sense of this context, and then I have to determine whether or not I trust you, and that's that process. Now, technology in many environments inverts this. And in social media in particular, our interactions in a social media environment in some ways are public by default, private through effort. Now that doesn't mean they're public to all people across all space and all time. Even if I have privacy settings set up on Facebook, they're semi-public in that it's public to the people that may be looking to my friends, to my audience. And the ease with which we can share by default changes this dynamic. The sharing becomes the default. And one of the things I find fascinating talking to teenagers is how often they actually just assume sharing, right? They assume that it's a lot easier to upload all of their photos than to choose which photos to upload, and they choose what to restrict rather than actually what to include. Right? It's easier, especially with a lot of quantified self dynamics, just to share it and then to choose what to exclude. And I'm fascinated by how aware young people are about what they don't want shared. Right, so they'll go out of their way to say, this might be embarrassing. I don't want to post that, so I will have it in a more private setting. I'll send it via text message, or I'll send it as a chat. Right, and I'll move these symbolic moves, even on a site like Facebook, to actually try to narrow the sense of audience. And that shifting around things, the ease with which we can share, the ease with which we can get things to a broad audience, is part of what complicates this. This is why, a lot of the young people I talk to is like, well, what's the harm in sharing it? It's not embarrassing or anything, right? And that logic is why we see so much in the way of data traces. And yet, when people are participating on these spaces, it doesn't mean that they have given up privacy. It means that they're actually choosing what they want to restrict or what they want to keep close. And I think a lot about, there's a beautiful article years ago by Angelina Jolie, interviewing Angelina Jolie. And the journalist was asking her about, how she seemed to share everything and, why'd she do this? And she looked at the journalist and said, the more that I appear to share, the more I can actually keep private. And there's something really beautiful about that kind of dynamic within these environments that I see young people adopting in really powerful ways. Okay, so we've got big data sort of smack in the middle of this because we've got all this data of all these traces, all of this stuff that people may have shared at different levels, assuming different kinds of visibility. And the question is what to do with it. We're living in an environment with a computational turn that results in having more data, more traces of data than ever before. But just because that data is accessible doesn't mean that it's actually meant to be mined in many of the ways that those of us in the room are doing so. How do we understand what people are trying to achieve? How do we understand why some of what we're doing might be perceived as problematic? One of the quotes that I heard, this is actually quite a few years ago at this point, this is a young woman named Bly, and she's on a radio station talking with her mother, and they're going back and forth about the logic. And her mother is talking about how, Bly puts all this material up on her website, or at this point it was actually LiveJournal. All this material is available. If anybody in the world can see it, I should be able to see it. And Bly turned around and said, my mom always uses the excuse about the internet being public when she defends herself for looking at this stuff. It's not like I do anything to be ashamed of, but a girl needs her privacy. I do online journals so I can communicate with my friends, not so my mother can catch up on the latest gossip of my life. What Bly is highlighting here is just because it's accessible doesn't mean that it was actually meant to be looked at. And there's all these questions of who is able to do that looking, and what is okay, and where are the boundaries of it. And what we see is that people really get uncomfortable when certain people are engaged in that looking. And this is about this crazy feeling of ick factor. And we hear this sort of creepiness or ickiness as a privacy violation, because that's the language that people know how to express their uncomfortableness with it. That doesn't mean that they know exactly where that discomfort comes from, but there's something wrong with it. Now, this is not just a question of all of our new techniques. This is in many ways an old issue. And I assume that many of you in this room saw the blow up about Target. But if you haven't seen that story, I think it's a really good indicator of an old technique. For a long time, we have been seeing companies do massive amounts of data collection in order to target audiences. And one of the things that companies like Target have learned over the years is that the best clients you can possibly get are those who are currently pregnant. Because if you're currently pregnant and you manage to switch to their store, once you have a child, you will not leave the store because you won't be bothered for many years. So there's a desire to target people who are pregnant. Well, the story goes, as reported by the New York Times, that a father of a 16-year-old is outraged because an advert comes to his home advertising for, her, saying, oh, for your first child, here's sort of these things you can buy. And the father purportedly calls up Target and screams at them as like, what are you doing? Target goes and looks at it and sort of decides to apologize, and they're profusely apologetic to the father. They call up a couple weeks later to sort of offer various amends, and the father responds, well, there are things that were happening in my house that I didn't even know about, right? And sure enough, the 16-year-old was pregnant, and sure enough, the father didn't know. It's not clear whether or not the teenage daughter knew. But part of this old school marketing issue is that it's really creepy, right? Yes, you can find this data. You can scan amazing amounts of data through the different kinds of social media material. You can even do it, you can cheat, right? Which is that, approximately 9 to 12 months after somebody actually checks, or posts something about a wedding on Facebook, they're likely to get pregnant. Right? These are cheating ways of doing it. It gets much more nuanced, much more detailed, and I'm sure there are people in the room who know how to do it. But there's something discomforting about it, and it's that discomfort that gets expressed as a privacy violation, even though this data has been available for a long time. And that's this challenge around power. Because where people get upset around privacy violations is when they feel as though their agency have been undermined, when they feel as though they lack a sense of power in the situations in which they're operating. And indeed, if you talk to people about who they're concerned about with regard to accessing their data, they almost always express it in terms of the people who hold power over them. For teenagers, it's their parents, it's teachers, it's college admissions officers, it's the people that they know, the people that are directly in their worlds, right? But the thing is things get a little bit more complex when we think about distanced power. And one of the things, Chris Hoofnagel's written extensively on this, people really don't know how to get in their head a sense of government power or a sense of corporate power. But they feel it when something feels icky, right? And they respond because of that ickiness. We saw this in terms of the blow up with Facebook's Beacon. We've seen this in terms of different kinds of tools that come in and just they don't feel right. Of course, there's a couple weeks ago, and I think there's some settlements going on about Facebook likes. These moments where you're just like, oh, that was a little too much. Where is that delicate line? Where do we find that creepiness? But it's only amongst that creepiness or amongst a moment where you can actually feel the violation that people really flip out. But this creates a challenge because that line is very gray. It is very uncertain, and it's very much experienced not as a set of technical affordances or technical logic, but a set of creepiness and uncomfort that has to do with people's sense of agency. This is where we also run into a challenge about certain values that are embedded into a lot of the systems that we build. And one of the values that comes across and is part of the ecosystem of Web 2.0 is this notion of radical transparency. And indeed, there are many people who have leveraged Web 2.0 technologies to share massive amounts of information about themselves. Heck, I have, right? And I've made a career out of sharing obscene amounts of information about myself. And we see people who love these tools because of doing that. And indeed, that's a value that we see in the tech industry of why to build these tools. But there's a big difference between making a choice to be radically transparent and actually actually exposing other people. And this is a two-sided coin that goes with a lot of what's happened with radical transparency. The ability to have celebrity, which some people desire, the ability to actually get massive amounts of attention, which some people really want, but the idea that you might be exposed, which for various reasons, whether because the technology settings have changed or because there's certain values within the technology itself, that is part of what complicates this matter. Now, there's actually a lovely history to go back to about how to think about the exposure due to radical transparency. And one of the ways that I love looking at it is through the history of the LGBT community and the notion of outing. Right? And there's a long set of debates within queer communities about whether or not it's appropriate to out somebody, especially if somebody is a public figure. Right? Is it their responsibility to be public about the fact that they're gay, or is this something that they have the right to actually keep as something that is personal? But there's a beautiful case that starts to show the messiness of this. And it's a case of a man named Oliver Siple. Oliver Siple was well known within the gay community in San Francisco. He was very out, very much involved in all of the Castro activities. His family did not live in San Francisco, and he cleaved his world between what occurred within San Francisco, within the Castro, and with what he did when he was with his family. Well, in 1975, I should also note, Oliver Siple was a Marine. He was trained as a Marine. He was a very capable man physically. And in 1975, a woman attempted to assassinate the US President Ford. Siple immediately jumped in, saw the situation for what it was, and pushed her away. And this is actually the picture of him pushing her. And in that process, she shot and she missed the president. She did not kill anybody. And he became a hero. And he became a hero, and the media wanted to cover all these stories about him. The San Francisco Chronicle immediately did, and he asked the Chronicle not to actually share information about his sexuality. They agreed. They did so, and they reported him as a hero. And then Harvey Milk, who was a well-known activist in San Francisco, decided that this was unacceptable, and people needed to know that Siple was gay because this would be beneficial to society to see a hero as someone who could be gay. Milk chose to out him, put it all over the press that he was gay, and the costs were devastating. Siple was completely, the White House completely divorced itself from Siple. They wanted nothing to do with him. They would not invite him to the White House. His family refused to talk to him. He began drinking profusely. He gained massive amounts of weight, and he died at the age of 47. One of the last things that his friends recorded him talking about was the fact that the thing he regretted the most in his life was his act of heroism. What this case does is it raises a critical question for us. What are the moral consequences of our decisions to expose people? What are the consequences of doing so even when we believe that it's good for society? And this question about how do we think about society and the values that we want to move forward with society and the costs to the individuals whose data we might be using, who might be participating in these spaces, becomes a really tricky one, especially when we're distanced from the people that we don't necessarily see. But it is an ethical question that will really be critical that we ask over and over again. The choice of which data you choose to put up on there, how identifiable that information is. What is the moral weight of it? What are the costs of it? Certainly from the conversation before around Syrian data sets, costs might be far greater than we can imagine. Now, context is everything. People put this material and make it available in a context. And a lot of what becomes difficult is that these contexts collide in really complex ways. And often you don't necessarily know how to deal with it algorithmically. I loved it because I do a lot of image searching, as you can imagine, from the things that I do. And of course, one of my favorites is when you get these sort of collisions. And this was a great image that came up over wedding, right? And I was looking for pictures around weddings. And of course, sure, we can see her as a wedding picture, but she's not necessarily in that context at this moment. And in fact, part of the challenge is that she's in this moment of confusion. And we know how to read this situation. We read this situation as a woman who is wearing a wedding dress who looks really, really miserable. Did the wedding, end in just moments ago? Did the guy not show up? Did he die? Who knows? We have no idea. But it's interesting to think about what this means algorithmically. Algorithmically, we see context collisions all the time, and we see things that are often very confusing. Mike Anani, one of the postdocs at MSR, had this amazing example that he was going through. He was in the process of looking at various mobile apps, and he downloaded Grindr. For those who do not know Grindr, it's a location-based app for gay men, and it's a location app where basically find gay men within your local vicinity. But what he found, which may or may not be visible in the lower left-hand corner, was that the related information of what else to download in the Android app store was for sex offender search, right? Now, how did this appear algorithmically? Did people really download these two apps together? We don't know. We don't know how this appeared, right? And of course, Google is not going to tell us. He asked a lot of these sort of critical questions online. Google's only response was to get rid of recommended related apps for Grindr. So again, we don't know. But what becomes tricky in this is that these are these moments of context where what they might mean to a machine is different than what they might mean to people. And what people interpret this as is deeply problematic. And for those who don't know, there's a long history of assumptions in the United States that gay men are sex offenders. And this week is not helping a lot of those questions, although I will give the press amazing credit for not covering the Sandusky case in quite that way. But this has been a pervasive narrative within the US. And so what does it mean when this pops up algorithmically? Now, how people deal with context on a regular basis is much more messy. And it's not to say that people have it figured out and algorithms don't. Context actually get confused by people all the time. This is a story of a young man who I interviewed by the name of Hunter. And if you want to picture in your head, Hunter was like the perfect Steve Urkel. I met him, he had glasses, they were broken, they had a tape down the middle of the glasses, sort of the perfect geek that you can imagine. A young black man living in DC. His parents are undocumented, and he lives in an environment where he talks a lot about how he really values school and education and the opportunities to get ahead, where his sister lives in a world that he defines as ghetto. And one of the things that he talks about is that he's always on Facebook in an environment where these contexts are colliding in his life. And he deals with this in a frustration because he finds that when he's talking to his friends, when he puts up a status, he hates when people who he's not addressing respond to it. And in particular, he talks about his sister. He posts something, he said, "Should I take offense to the fact that someone put the ringtone white and nerdy is for me?" And it was a joke. And we were all talking in school, and my sister comes out of nowhere and is like, "Oh, baby bro." And I'm like, "No, don't say that, I wasn't talking to you." So I ask him, how do you know who's being talked to? How do people understand what the boundaries are, what the context is? And he says, I guess that's the point. It's probably hard, but just it's a certain way you talk. I talk to my sister in a different way than friends at school. Right, and what he's saying is that he's trying to signal different things. He's trying to make his messages very clear, and he fails miserably. And one of the things he talks about is how after a period of time of trying to do this successfully, he gave up. And he in particular decided to turn to technical mechanisms to try to restrict this. The other thing about Hunter is he's really into Pokemon and Legends of Zelda, which he and his friends think are super cool and retro, which I take a little bit of offense to because that was my favorite games when I was a young person, and that just makes me old. But the thing is, he's really into Zelda. He thinks it's great. But whenever he posts about Zelda, his cousins make fun of him because his cousins point out that the whole key is actually to be in shooter games because shooter games are cool. And so what he started to do is literally create different contexts within Facebook, different lists so that he could actually post things about shooter games that would go to his cousins but not to his friends, and he would post things about Legends of Zelda that would just go to his friends. Did he care that the other knew about it? No, not at all. Anybody who knew him knew both sides. But what he cared about was who was commenting and how they were responding to each other. And this is one of the challenges of how to maintain context, and it becomes extraordinarily difficult. Now, technology is one way of achieving sense of boundaries, and I like some of the more extreme tactics that I've seen. And I'll tell you about two of them. One is a young woman named Shamika, and Shamika was running into this problem where everybody was taking her past content out of context and bringing it forward. So she decided to engage in a practice that she describes as whitewalling. She would log into Facebook, and she would read the comments that were left for her. She would read the various notes on her photos or whatever, and then she would delete the comments. And then she would delete the photo. She would allow things up for about a day. She would post comments on other people's pages, and then she would delete them. And the idea was that she kept her wall white. Right? Now, the thing that was really funny in talking with her about this is I was like, well, you know that people could go and grab some of that and post it up again. And she pointed out, she's like, yes, but that would be creepy. And her idea was that it would violate the social norms to do so, and that this was a way of symbolically saying that these are the rules, these are the boundaries. It was one of her ways of maintaining it. Is this a common practice? No, but it's an extreme example of something that I think is important to realize as a possibility of the ways in which young people try to achieve privacy. Another one, which I think is fabulous, is a young woman named Makayla. This is another sort of rare case. She found with Facebook that when you try to delete your account on Facebook, it says, oh, you don't really want to delete it, do you? Just deactivate it. And she was like, okay. So every day she logs in to her account on Facebook, and when she is done using it for the day, she deactivates her account. Okay? She logs in the next day and reactivates it, and then when she's done using it, she deactivates it. Right? And it's her way of keeping it so that only people that are logged in at that moment can contact her. It's a way of treating it as a real-time activity. And I was pushing her on trying to understand why, and the thing that's important to understand about Makayla is that she's in foster care and she's dealing with the state on a regular basis. And she points out that adults only look at these things during the day, and teens only look at these things at night. So when the adults log in during the day, she doesn't exist, and no adult would actually look at it at night, so she can hang out with her friends. Right? This is her logic of how to actually achieve a sense of privacy. How effective it is, who knows? She knows that these barriers are porous, but part of it is still her effort to get there. Now, over and over again, we hear about different ways that young people sort of try to achieve this sort of sense of certain people. This is a quote from a young woman named Carmen. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Carmen. Carmen is a young woman of Hispanic descent. Her parents moved to the States when she was young in order to give her opportunities. They don't have necessarily American context, and they certainly don't have European context. So that's important as we go forward. Because one day, one of the things that Carmen runs into over and over again is that she finds that her mother, who she loves having on Facebook, tends to overreact to everything. And her overreaction causes all of these social troubles for her. And part of the problem is that whenever her mom comments on one of her updates, sort of everybody goes away, right? Because as she points out, it's like everyone kind of disappears after the mom post, right? When mom posts things, that's just kind of weird. I should note, grandparents are totally acceptable, moms are not. But one of the things about Carmen is she's having a really bad day, and she wants to express herself to all of her friends. For those who don't spend an obscene amount of time with teenagers, you might not know that the way in which young people express themselves is through song lyrics and other copied content elsewhere. So she wants to choose a song lyric to explain that she and her boyfriend had just broken up and that she feels really crappy. But she knows if she puts something up that's really emotive or really depressing, her mom will flip out and be convinced that she's suicidal. She knows this because this has happened before, and she really doesn't want to deal with this. So she decides she wants to communicate with her friends, but not communicate with her mother. So what does she do? She picks up song lyrics from Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, for those who do not know the Monty Python reference, it is sung during the part of the life of Brian where the key character is being executed. It is not a happy song. The words are perfectly fine. And sure enough, she puts up these song lyrics, and her mother immediately comments on Facebook, "Looks like you're having a good day." And her friends all call her, right? Because this is a way of actually achieving privacy through encoding. And so one of the ways that I think of this is a strategy that I understand as social steganography. Now, for those who are not cryptographers, steganography is an age-old concept of hiding in plain sight. It is the ultimate security through obscurity. And the examples that go back historically are often deeply disturbing. So the idea of like the Greeks who would tattoo messages on the slaves' heads, let their hair grow out, and then send them off. And so who would know to look for the actual message? Right? This kind of thing. Wax tablets, you get it. Well, what happens in online media is that people are engaged in an act of social steganography. They're putting out material that's publicly accessible, but the meaning is encoded. And what I've found is that the best way that young people have figured out how to achieve privacy in an online environment is to not focus on limiting access to content, but to focus on limiting access to meaning. And it's extraordinarily successful. The result of which is that over the last decade of me talking to young people about what they're doing online, I have learned I can no longer interpret anything of what I see. And so when I talk to teenagers, I'm often surprised and I have to actually decrypt what's going on. So take this example. Right, I'm sitting in North Carolina with 2 teenagers. I see this on one of their Facebooks. It says, "I'm sick and tired of all of this," and it's liked by 32 people. Later on, somewhere else, I see this post, "She's such a bitch," and it's liked by 50 people. I'm like, what's going on? And my informant went into this massive tirade about how there was a breakup, and there was this boy, and there was jealousy, and this is the drama, and she had the full story. And she knew that these 2 messages were just pointing to a much more complex issue. And what I found in looking at young people's activity online is that they heavily use references and they use pronouns because if you're already in the know, you know what's going on. So you don't necessarily need to make the details available. This kind of encoding is an attempt to really achieve privacy. It complicates all of our data analysis. It complicates how we understand what's happening, but it's really an attempt to achieve it. Now, this is something I find really fascinating, particularly when people take these out of context in really problematic ways. And it creates for some awkward situations. I was sitting on a panel about marketing and data mining and all these sort of things, and one of the most awkward moments was this representative from Coca-Cola who was loudly talking about how they had achieved millions of friends and they were really popular and everybody was talking about them and they were super cool. And the problem is that I had been hanging out with teenagers long enough to know that that was not the Coke they were referring to. And that was a little hard to explain to a group of people who didn't necessarily want to hear that there might be another reference going on. Right? And so how do we actually start to make meaning of what's going on? Here I want to give you sort of 4 key things to think about as we start to collectively figure out how to deal with big data. The first is that what we're facing is really messy. This data is messy. You know this. You're playing with the data. It's ugly. But the thing is that getting rid of the externalities, getting rid of the things, trying to model it into something clean, you often lose some of the most critical aspects of what's going on. You really need to be attentive to the data that you're playing with. You really know how to live and breathe it and how to cook it and how to realize that the data that you're excluding is just as important as the data you're including. Right? And taken out of context, a lot of this doesn't make sense. So it becomes really important to embrace that mess and to deal with it and not model it away mathematically. And I think that's really critical for those of you who are computer scientists or mathematicians or physicists. Right? Reducing a directed graph into an undirected one doesn't make sense just because it's mathematically easier to compute. Really understand that mess, and we need to deal with the complexity of it, or we're doing a disservice to the kinds of data that we're seeing. The next critical thing to keep in mind is that you need to prioritize the interpretation of it. Just because you have data, just because you can throw it to the wall, doesn't mean you know what it's about. Really go and ask about that interpretation. What are the possible interpretations of what you're seeing? How do you ask possible alternatives? This is one of the reasons why I strongly believe that computer scientists and social scientists need to work together. This is not always a science. In fact, it is critically not for a lot of the data that we're dealing with. It is about the interpretation, and that interpretation is extraordinarily important. Third key thing is that we're dealing with network data. We're dealing with networked privacy. These two are entwined, and we need to actually realize that just because we live in an environment where everything is about the individual doesn't mean that the data we're dealing with is about the individual. And these two get messy really fast. I'm really fascinated by what's happening with DNA data in particular, right? Because I might choose to give all of my data to 23andMe, right? I might think it's really cool to give that away. But I haven't just given away my data. I've given away my mother's data. I've given away my brother's data. All of that data is interconnected. We run into the same things in social data. Just because you have access to some or permission to use somebody's data doesn't mean you have access or permission to use everybody else's data. But a lot of these things are really confusing. Who owns this data, right? And certainly this is one of the biggest challenges for the tech companies trying to figure this out because they really want to believe in the individual, but network data doesn't allow us to get there. And one of the challenges is that we also have a networked privacy issue because people give away data not realizing that they're giving away information about others. So I'll relate this to a security example because I think it's really fascinating. I'm amazed by the number of people over 50 who've gotten into genealogy online. They love genealogy. They think it's fantastic. And they go and they put up these very highly public information about everybody's mother's maiden name. Right? Privacy question for pretty much everything, right? And here we have it publicly revealed, right? One of the tricks with a lot of what we're dealing with is we've got data that's revealing massive amounts of information, especially when you start to combine it together. For those who aren't familiar with Alessandro Acquisti's work, I strongly recommend checking it out. That's some of the most critical work in trying to really untangle some of this. Another key, fourth key sort of thing to keep in mind is that informed consent is often talked about as the solution, but it's extraordinarily hard. First off, being informed is really, really tricky. Most people have no idea what it means to deal with this kind of data. There is a lack of data literacy in this country, let alone computational literacy. And so with the idea of getting somebody to a point where they actually understand the consequences is extraordinarily challenging. Finally, what is consent? Consent is not a contract. It's not something you can sign away, and it's certainly not something in legalese that you can agree to. How do you get people to actually deal with the power dynamics of consent so that you can actually engage with them? This is a huge ethical issue for all of you who are working with data. How do we treat that with the biggest respect we can deal with? And I want to keep this in mind because there's a critical set of issues coming around big data. And Larry Lessig has talked extensively about how systems are regulated by 4 forces. Those who haven't seen his red dot, he loves his red dot. His red dot highlights that any given social system has 4 forces regulating it at any given point. The market, what is economically viable or desirable, the technology or architecture or code, the law and what is legal regulation, and social norms. When these 4 are aligned, magic happens, but they rarely are aligned. What we are seeing is a moment where technology is pushing us to new possibilities. Certainly the market is interested and invested in certain angles. Social norms are in a state of complete flux and confusion. But what we really have to deal with is the fact that regulation is coming. And you may not like it, you may not want it, but we're going to see a lot of regulation around big data coming really shortly. I'm not sure if it's going to start in Europe, if it's going to start in Canada, or if it's going to start in the States, but I expect it to come fast. Part of why regulation is coming is that this is about change, and people are really uncomfortable with change. People are panicking. I live in a world of studying young people. One of my favorite things about studying young people is that kids are always going to be at the excuse of why we should regulate data. And it's because about kids' data that we will start to see different kinds of regulation. But the reason I think that this is important for this community to think about, many of you have nothing to do with regulation, you don't really care about the law, but everything that we do as researchers is going to be impacted by the regulation around data. And we can pretend like it's not coming, but we actually are in a better position to understand it. Nothing good comes out of playing ostrich. We can't play with this data and just avoid what's happening. We have to think through the ethics and values about this data, about how to handle the privacy issues in a really responsible way, because if we actually start to inform this conversation, it will go a lot better than when you have regulators just coming in and panicking. You guys understand the data, you understand what's possible with this, and it's really important that you get into the conversation about regulation. In order to get there, we need to really ask what are our values with regard to ethics. What are the ethics of this community? The ethics question is one that's really critical to social science. It's one that's at the heart of what we do, and it's really important that computer scientists start having this conversation as well. The data that you're dealing with is people's data. This is about people's lives. There are costs to the kinds of data you're dealing with. Figuring out what the ethics and boundaries and norms are, not what the IRB says that they are, but what is really important and at the essence of this community is extremely important. Now, one of the challenges I would argue to think through is something that I'm already seeing with the regulation space. Regulation historically has been about access and collection. It's about who has access to it and who is collecting the data. The challenge is that people share. People share massive amounts of information. And so the model of access and collection is not actually going to work. And what we're going to see is a shift. And that shift has to do with usage. Right? It has to do with how do we model and understand who is using data for what purposes. And certainly we can come up with really good examples of really good uses, things that are really positive and productive, and really bad uses, things that we want to stop. Right? But part of it is how do we actually get that into a sensible way so that not all usage is bad. Right? And how do we come up with a way of regulating regulating this space that actually makes sense around usage? Now, I think that there's some really interesting history here within the legal world. And one of the examples that I love to give has to do with affirmative action and the politics of discrimination. If you come into my office, by your mere presence, can make a lot of informed information that I can gather from you just by you being present. I have a pretty good sense of your gender. I have a pretty good sense roughly of your age. I have a pretty good sense of your ethnicity. I have a pretty good sense of your national origin. I have a pretty good sense of different informations about class. Are they perfect? No, they're not clean, but I can make those pretty easily in coming in. And yet, the anti-discrimination laws say that I cannot use this information to discriminate against you. Is this perfect? No. People discriminate all the time. But the fact is that we have a way of thinking through usage that deals with this. And this is one way of thinking about how usage can be regulated. But I would argue that in this community of people where you're living and breathing the kinds of usage issues, starting to articulate positive and negative usage and figuring out what the norms and values around that are extremely important. Because this tidal wave of regulation is going to come, and it's going to come and bite us all in the tush and stop us from doing the things that we really like to do, as well as hopefully preventing some of the things that we don't want to see happening. I'm not entirely that confident in it, because when we see these kinds of legal interventions, they're not always so pretty. But I think that it would behoove us to not play ostrich and to really think through some of that issues. And part of it is that there's a lot of exciting things about big data. There's a lot of exciting things about what we can do, what we model, how we can think about it. But if we don't take a moment to step back and really ask hard questions of our community, if we don't take a moment to step back and understand why people are flipping out around privacy, why they're uncomfortable, we will not actually be able to create a lot of the things that we're hoping to create. And we are at that moment, that sort of odd cross-section where these things are happening, they're highly visible, there's a massive amount of attention to it. And really untangling these issues would benefit all of us. Thank you very much.